No? Yeah? Okay, number three. Why could Jesus interpret the law correctly? Why could Jesus interpret the law correctly? All right, good. Good. The second one is when we contrast things, what are we looking for? What are we looking for when we contrast things? Okay. All right, let's go through and answer these questions. Number one, what does Sanhedrin mean? Sorry? No, but I think I know what you're after, and I could see why there you would think that because there's something very close. Yep, Dean? The 70. Okay. 70 what? Jud- Judges, the elders of Israel. Yeah, good. And where does that come from? Any idea? We don't need to take a long time for this, but yeah, well, the 70 that were called upon by Moses to help him lead. So, yeah, good. All right. And so there's 70 elders. What were they essentially doing? Huh? Religious leader? They were religious leaders, but I'm thinking of one particular context. Judging, right? Just think of when you think of Sanhedrin, think of the Supreme Court of Israel. Somewhere the ESV has some really good diagrams in its study Bible. I don't know if you've seen it, but in one they have a picture of the Sanhedrin, and I think they show, if I remember correctly, how many were sort of Pharisees and how many were Sadducees. But these are the religious leaders of Israel, and they sat in judgment over Israel, kind of doing what Moses originally was doing. But Jethro said, "You're going to wear yourself out, bud. You need to get some help." And the Lord told him that was wisdom, and so he found 70 elders and he appointed them to help him judge. And that was the case even to Jesus' day. All right. When we contrast things, what are we looking for? Differences. Okay. If you have differences, that's good. Just just for contrast. Sorry. The truth. Well, yes. Hopefully you're looking for the truth in all the questions that you're doing. Just for contrast, what's the difference between contrast and comparison? What are you looking for when you compare things? Similarities. You're looking for similarities and differences when you compare and contrast. Okay. All right. Last one. Why could Jesus interpret the law correctly? Why could Jesus interpret the law correctly? He wrote it. Okay. He was responsible for it. He wrote it. Wrote it. Maybe. Would you be okay if we said that he gave it? He gave it. He was the giver of the law. Okay. Good. All right. Tonight, I hope this won't disappoint you, but I want to talk a little bit more about the last passage from last week. Um, I felt like I ran out of time a little bit and was thinking about it on the way home last week. And we talked about terms a lot, but I'm not satisfied that I communicated the structure of Jesus' statements. So I thought we'd look into it a little bit more. And as I looked at this verse a little bit more this week, I want to make sure that the emphasis of what Jesus was saying is communicated right. Like I think there's an emphasis there that we didn't dwell so much on. We talked about lots of different stuff surrounding what Jesus said. So we're in Matthew 5, and we'll be in verse 21 and 22, and then but we're going to extend upon it and talk about all the way to verse 26. 26. We'll end with 26, but 21 and 22 is what we talked about last week, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. So um, let's read Matthew 5:21 through 22, and then we'll read some other parts of that when we get further in. Okay, you've heard that it was said uh, to the people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or a sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. That sounds serious, doesn't it? Like we're talking about some serious stuff here. Jesus emphatically, he tells us emphatically that he's reinterpreting the law. How does he do that? How does he tell us that he's reinterpreting the law? Just based on what we read right there. You've heard it said, but I say to you. Okay? So he's telling us very emphatically. And how do we know that this is emphatic? Do you remember this? We talked about this last week. Lego my ego, right? We wanna remember that. So Lego is the word for I say, but he also doubles down on that and he says ego before that. Ego de Lego. That's what it would be in Greek, and he's saying but I say to you. So this is a real indicator of emphasis here. He doubles down on emphasizing that these things are his words and that he has the right to interpret them. Okay, so just remember, if you need to remember that, Lego my ego, that may help you to remember what we talked about, because Lego is the word for I say, and ego is the word for I. So if you want to write that down somewhere, that's just interesting to know. It doesn't change the meaning. I think we can essentially get that, but what it does is it gives us a little more oomph to it. Like we know the emphasis here is he's maybe correcting a wrong insight here, uh, and I think he is. He's emphasizing something with a little more strength than before. But here he contrasts some things. He takes a place in the text between the existing warning and the extended warning. Or excuse me, contrast takes place in the text between the existing warning and the extended warning. And so when we contrast things, what are we looking for? Okay, so Jesus says, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." So there's anybody remember? Maybe this is just my time. I'm not sure, but there used to be some on TV on Saturday um, between cartoons. Couldn't think of it. Couldn't think of cartoons. I'm in serious adult world too often. Couldn't think of the word cartoon. But they had this little thing called Schoolhouse Rock. Anybody remember Schoolhouse Rock? Okay. Do you remember conjunction junction? What's your function? They're serving up verbs or words and phrases and clauses. And in that one, as he's talking about conjunctions, he's talking about things that connect sentences, right? And what are some of those conjunctions? And, okay. And, but, for, okay. Or, sorry, for, yes, or is good. Okay. There's others. Let's just start with these. Okay. This is this conjunction right here, and then it escapes me what it's called at the moment, but this particular one, but, is an adversative. Okay. You came to church tonight to get grammar, I'm sure. And this could also be contrastive, I suppose, but contrastive. This, and I can't think of the word for whatever reason. It should be right on the tip of my tongue. I didn't write it down. But what this is doing is basically adding to what's said. When you look at and, right? You're adding to what's said. Or shows the possibility of this or that. And if you want to know all about this, just go to YouTube and look up Schoolhouse Rock conjunction junction, and you can see it, and you can watch the whole thing. It's kind of amazing that I saw that over and over again on Saturday, and it didn't get deep down in my soul like it should have. And it was even in cartoon format, which I should have really liked. I do, and the song was catchy too. But what's interesting about this is that when it comes to and, there is a word for this in the Greek New Testament, and it's kai. What? Coordinating conjunction. Thank you, sir. That's very astute of you. I'm going to call that. Okay, there we go. Coordinating conjunction. And typically in Greek, you're going to get something like this. Okay, and when you have an adversative, it's sometimes this day. Okay. And what's interesting is that these both flex a little bit, so that sometimes you can use Kai as an adversative, and sometimes you can use day as a coordinating conjunction. But here in this passage, all of the conjunctions are this word. So that may come into play a little bit later on, because there's times where Jesus says and when it could be but. Or our translations say and when it could be but. In fact, if you look at different translations, sometimes they'll say and or but here. And so it shows that there's contrast in this. And I think that's one of the things that we should get from this passage is the idea that there is contrast here, and this is what Jesus is pulling out. I learned something interesting this last week, that a couple things interesting that you might be interested to know, and it's just like extra. It's extra. Do you know that in Hebrew they don't have periods that show the end of sentences? Did I talk about this already? They didn't have in biblical Hebrew. I don't know what they do in modern Hebrew, but in biblical Hebrew they didn't have sentences. Do you know the way that they started a new sentence? And you might be able to guess. That's it. Ever read Mark and you're like, this guy likes ands a whole bunch. He's writing in kind of a Hebrew fashion, even though he's writing to Romans. So this would be like the indicator of a new sentence when you see and or but. So I think they probably take the Hebrew letter for that is vav, and it essentially tells you there's a new sentence beginning here, and it could be adversative and it could be coordinating. Either way, okay. We've gotten far too nerdy. Let's get back to reality here. Jesus is saying, "You've heard this said, but I say to you." I say to you. And he shows us there's a contrast between two things, between what's been said before and what's being said now. I told you there was another thing. The other thing that I found out, just I don't want to leave you hanging on this, is that biblical Hebrew didn't have a word yes. Did you know that? Now here's what's really fascinating about it, is the way that you affirmed a question was by restating the question as a statement. Okay, so 1 Samuel 16. Samuel goes to Bethlehem, and everybody's in fear and trembling because this mighty man of God is coming to town. And like, have we done something wrong? Is God going to strike us? Like, why is the prophet here? He has no clue that he's going to anoint one of their own king. And so they ask, have you come in peace? What does Samuel say? Yes? No? I have come in peace. That's the affirmative. And apparently that follows even into Jesus's day, because in Jesus's day, and we often miss this, and people who say Jesus never claimed to be a king, he never claimed to be God, it's because we're looking for him to state things in our cultural way and not his cultural way. So Pilate says to him, "Are you a king?" What's Jesus say? "You have said." That's an affirmative. That's an affirmative, and we don't always get that. Now that's not exactly the claim to deity, but he does that in other places that we should know. All right. That would be probably from a thus. They have another word that's like thus or so, and it's not exactly a yes. But yes, that's a good thought. I thought of that. It's not exactly the same. So, amen. Yeah, that's so be it, right? So we can talk about that more another time. Look into it a little bit, but just thought that was interesting, and you might want to know. So there's a contrastive thing that's going on here. Jesus saying, "This is what you've heard, but I say to you." All right. And in contrasting here, he's contrasting how the law has been taken in the past and how it should be taken as its interpreter. And so I want to mention a couple things where he extends what's been believed and what's been practiced or what's been thought to a new level. Okay, so let's call this first one extension 1. Okay, extension 1. He's going to extend this. He upgrades the seriousness of anger. Okay, he upgrades the command of murder. It's not an upgrade. I wouldn't say it's even an upgrade, but he's extending their thinking on this because previously there have been those that have taught, Jewish teachers had taught, that nothing except murder was forbidden by the sixth commandment. But Jesus is saying, look, murder starts before the murder takes place, right? We talked about the difference between the different words for killing last week and how there's a particular one that's used in the Ten Commandments that's not just killing, but it's murder. And so the Jewish teachers taught nothing except murder is prohibited here, but Jesus, and so they explain away a lot of the other stuff. All this is saying is you can't murder, and Jesus is taking this further. The anger, he's saying, he's elevating, or I should say, upgrading the seriousness in people's minds of how serious anger really is. Okay, so what we should know about that, we're not talking about just the kind of anger where somebody does something and boy, it makes you really upset. Okay, I think we should be careful there. But I think what Jesus is talking about, and we dealt with this a little more last week, is a sustained anger, like a stative anger, like something that resides within us. It's not just anger that you got mad because something happened. That can be dangerous enough. But when anger resides in us, it builds towards a negative. Okay? And so he's dealing with a stative kind of thing here. Because anger that is stative is being fed and fueled. It doesn't just die out. Like if we're forgiving people, anger in time will subside. Now I'm not saying, like, if you think about it, maybe that would come back and you can feed it. You can replay the tape. That's such an old picture anymore. Nobody plays the tapes anymore. We stream. But we restream that thought, that event, the offense that was committed against us. And so it's anger that's being fed and fueled, and it's an anger that remains. And I think the point here is to minimize the distance between anger and murder. This is what Jesus is doing. Okay, and Jesus, it's enough that Jesus does it, but this echoes all through the New Testament. We get down to James, and James says, I think it's John actually who says this in 1 John. He says, anyone who hates his brother, do you remember, is what? Is a murderer. And we know that no murderer has eternal life in him. So John is saying this kind of hatred, maybe he's playing off the word here for anger, or he's referring to Jesus' teaching that this is the kind of thing that is the motivation for murder. Okay? So Jesus is dealing with this. He's minimizing the distance between anger and murder. And of course, the act of murder has immediate and lasting consequences, and it's easy to see why that should be taken seriously. But Jesus is showing the seriousness of anger, and we should understand that he's talking about this sustained anger. And when we think of all the destruction that's been done because of anger, including murder, it's not just a harmless emotion. Okay? I think Lynn and I were talking about this after last week, and it occurs to me that we live in a culture it doesn't matter, but we're coming off of 200 years of what's called romanticism. Romanticism essentially teaches that people should express themselves. We should express ourselves, and the true self needs to be expressed. Okay, you'll hear this all the time. I've got to be me would be some form of statement of that. That's not Christianity. That's romanticism. Christianity says, "Come and die to self." Romanticism says you got to express yourself. Okay, and so a lot of people have taken the logical next step to that they say, I have a right to my emotions. Okay? Have you heard that? Maybe you've felt that even, like, I have a right to feel whatever I want to feel. And actually, if you look biblically, we don't have a right to just feel however we want to feel. All things belong to God, and we have a responsibility to respond rightly to God, not just in our actions, but in our emotions too. I'll give you a couple examples of this. One is when Abel is angry in Genesis 4, and God says to him, "What's going on here?" And Abel's angry because his sacrifice hasn't been accepted, and God says to him, "Sin is crouching at your door, but you must master it." Okay, it wants to have you, but you must master it. If you jump forward to places like right after Mount Carmel, and Elijah is there in the cave. He's hiding out. God comes to him and confronts him. It's like, "What are you doing here?" And I'm the only one. He goes down the litany of self-pity. I'm the only one who's not bowed my knee. And God's like, "Ask him again, what are you doing here? You're not, this isn't where you're supposed to be, living in self-pity. You need to be about the Lord's work." But he's there caught in his self-pity. He gets challenged in his self-pity. Um, Abel gets challenged in his resentment. Later on, Jonah goes to Nineveh, and he knows God's going to save Nineveh. Do you remember that? And then he sits outside the city, and he's like counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I knew it. You were going to save this city. And he's mad. And God sends a vine to shelter him from the sun. And then he sends a worm to take away the vine. And he's mad. Do you remember what God said to him? Do you have a right to be angry? We think we have a right to our emotions. Scripture challenges that. We don't have a right to our emotions. We have to respond in the way that God wants us to. And if there's wrong emotions, including anger, we have to deal with that. And we can't just say, "Well, I have just a right to feel however I feel." No, we have to, by the power of the Spirit, allow God and choose to let God change our emotions to agree with what's true and right. Okay? So we don't just get to seethe and let it continue on. There's danger in that. And so Jesus is showing that anger too will be subjected to judgment. So look at what he's saying here. There's the kind of a comparison contrast that's taking place. He says, first of all, you've heard that it was said to people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders is subject to judgment." Okay, everybody understood that. That you murder somebody, you're going to be brought before the council. They're going to declare you guilty based on the witness of 2 or 3 witnesses, and then they will give you the death sentence. Okay, you're guilty of judgment. Everybody would recognize that, but Jesus ups it a little bit, and he says this. But I tell you, verse 22, that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Same thing. So previously judgment, and now he's saying even anger will bring you to a place of judgment. Okay, sustained anger. I'm not trying to suggest to you that like you get mad because something happens and it's like a come and go kind of thing. Okay. Yes, be careful of that. Let's respond in our anger in the appropriate way. But I think what Jesus is talking about here is this kind of sustained anger. And there's reasons for understanding it that way based on the way that he uses this, the word for anger. Okay, so there's that. So then this first extension then is from murder to anger. Okay? From murder to anger. Okay, and then you have extension 2 here. And this is from court to hellfire. This is where he extends this. So now it gets even bigger. This is an interesting thing. He upgrades the seriousness of the punishment. Before he's upgraded the seriousness of the crime. Now he's upgrading the seriousness of the punishment. And maybe upgrade's the wrong word because it suggests change. I think perhaps all of these things were always in play. Like God was going to judge Old Testament people for their emotions, not just their actions. And he will us too, and especially now that we're in the know. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It does. I think it does. My point is that he's showing that it's not just murder that causes a person to come to judgment. but anger. So that's the upgrade that I'm talking about. Is that maybe the upgrade is the upgrade of anger to the level of murder. But there's a change in how Jesus presents the interior of a person versus how the Old Testament emphasized the exterior. Although the interior is there too. You're not supposed to covet. Who can, I mean, if you kept it hidden or tried your best, I think a person could probably covet without it being visible to many people except God. Okay, and I know that in the end, our heart works out and those things will come about. But let's talk about the beginning stages before it takes serious root. If you're coveting there, maybe nobody notices that you really want what they have. You wish you were married to their spouse. Okay, you wish you had that land. Like, think of Ahab, how he wanted Naboth's vineyard, and that was his ancestral plot. He couldn't even sell it if he wanted to. Okay, so the beginning stages of it, I mean, you could tell from Ahab because he laid on his side like a big baby and whined. Remember that? Wasn't it? Just like, you can tell the Bible's true. Just look at the characters. I mean, that's real people stuff right there. Real people do that kind of stuff. But I guess what I'm saying is that these things heaven sees, even if humanity doesn't. Okay, heaven sees them, even if humanity doesn't. So he's upgrading now the seriousness of the punishment. I don't necessarily think, let's just say, from court to hellfire. I'm only going to leave this for a second because I want to write something else here. So this is an extension that's taking place here. All right, from court to hellfire. I don't think that Raka, what does Raka mean again? Anybody remember from last time? Okay, yeah, something like that. I don't think these two things need to be that far apart, actually. I think early on I was thinking, and you fool must be a terrible difference, but I think that there is a difference, which we talked about last week, but I don't think the difference between those two things is the point. I think what Jesus is doing is now shifted focus on the end result. Okay, and so we'll talk about that. But Raka, empty-headed, and Matthew could be quoting from the Aramaic word here, and it carries some kind of malice that a Greek word wouldn't, and so he actually brings this over while he's written, or at least his translators have translated in Greek. They leave this word in either Aramaic or it could be a Aramaic extension of a Hebrew word. So this word carries some significant meaning that you wouldn't get from its Greek counterpart. Okay, let me give you another example. I used one last week but here's another one. In Spanish-speaking cultures, in American culture, if you use the word stupid, it has a bad connotation to it. But if you use that in a Spanish-speaking culture, that's high insult. Did you know that? That stupido, that is way worse than the English equivalent stupid. It's very, very insulting. And so there may be something like that that's taking place here. And then fool, I think, probably has the connotation of rebel with it, an outsider to the covenant community, as we talked about last week. So Raka, empty-headed, you fool, they're kind of similar in what they're talking about, but maybe a little bit different nuance to it. And it may suggest somebody's outside the covenant community, okay? Proverbs is really big on this. When it calls people fool, it's recognizing that not only are they dumb, but they're dumb on purpose because they're being rebellious. That's what fool connotates from Proverbs. But as I was thinking about this week, it occurred to me that Jesus may not be escalating the word choice here, but the punishment. So rock and fool could be synonyms in kind of an antithetical Hebrew poetry. Now that might be a mouthful, but if you would, think about this, that Jesus, did you know Jesus spoke in poetry? Did you know that? That he actually spoke in Hebrew parallelism. Even some think he was speaking Aramaic. Some think he spoke Hebrew. I think there was probably a little bit of a mixture, but maybe the bigger that he spoke was Hebrew. But we know that he uses parallelism, and parallelism does something which we may not recognize or realize. I've got a verse here I wanted to show us. Okay, this is from Proverbs 14:11 here. Okay, the house, this is antithetical parallelism, which means that it's showing one thing and then it's showing the opposite of it. But it actually uses synonyms early on. So let me make sure I can write on this. Yes. So what are the synonyms here? Okay, good. House and tent, they're synonymous. Okay. What's the antithesis here? What's that? Okay, that's true. And what else? Destroyed and flourish. Okay. So you have synonyms and then you have antonyms. Is that the right word? Okay. If it's not, I can never remember where the Y is on this. Is that good enough for us? Can you get the message here? These being the antonyms, these being the synonyms. Okay, they're synonymous with each other. And I wonder when Jesus is saying, whoever says Raka will be in danger of the court, but whoever says you fool will be in danger of hellfire, if he's not using some kind of synonymous parallelism in order to come to an elevated sense of what the destiny is of those two. I'll do my best to explain that a little bit better with the time we have left here. Get rid of this for now. Okay. So Jesus does this in other places where he uses parallelism. Matthew 6:13, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Temptation and evil are supposed to be essentially the same thing there. Okay, whoever finds his life will lose it, but whoever loses life for my sake will find it. Jesus was a poet, I'm telling you. Matthew 7:7, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Those are not intended to be taken literally, except for the first one. Ask and seek, I suppose. Seek might be the better one. But these are all synonyms that are saying essentially the same thing in three different ways. It's a way of doubling down or tripling down in that case. And I think that he could be using that kind of parallelism here to show contrast. So what's similar is the word rock and fool. What's different is the level of punishment. And so what gets changed in the contrast here is that level of punishment. I said last week that court in verse 22 may mean heaven's court, and there are some scholars that believe that, and it still could mean that, but it seems more likely to me that he's referring to the earthly court. He uses a word that you will recognize here when he uses court. Okay, that's the word. What's that look like to you? Sanhedrin. Okay, I think that's possible that he's talking about when he talks about the court, verse 22. Look at that with me again here. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. Okay, court. Do you have something else? Do you have counsel there? Maybe somebody has counsel in your translation. Anybody have anything different than either one of those? Okay. Court here, I think a better understanding is Earth's court, some kind of court like the Jewish Supreme Court. But then he says, whoever says you fool will be in danger of hell's fire. So I don't know that the point is to show the difference between rock and fool. I think the point is to show that insults of this kind will ultimately lead to hellfire. I think that's his point. And so what he wants us to know is that we should not be loose about how we talk about people, because it matters from heaven's perspective and we'll be judged on that basis. Remember, James said something like this, and he tells us a little bit of the reason why is because when we speak against people in this way, we blaspheme them. Actually, do you know that's the word for slander is blaspheme, to blaspheme other people. I thought you could only blaspheme God. Well, have you ever thought about this? That people are made in the image of God? James says this in James 3:9. With our tongue we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. And so God takes these things a lot more seriously than we do. So what are we supposed to do with all of this? Well, he gives us a kind of practical application here in verse 23. He says, therefore, which connects it to everything that's gone before. He says, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. Okay, we might like to read that. If somebody else has done us wrong, we should stop worshiping and go make them get it right. But that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about if we remember they have something against us, we should go and make it right. In other words, God takes very seriously our relationship with other people. We need to do the right thing as an act of worship. God cares about relationships with other people, and when they're not right, it affects our worship. If you read Isaiah and Micah, or any of the minor prophets, let's say Malachi chapter 2, where the temple sacrifices were not accepted because people were offering them while mistreating other people. You remember that whole God has shown you, O man, what he desires of you? Micah what? What is it? 6:8? Okay. Um, that's all talking about in the context of worship. You're trying to worship God, but people were defrauding other people, and he's like, you guys should just shut the doors of the temple, not even come here. If you're going to treat people like that, your worship might be really good from the sense of the technical cultic aspect that's described in the Old Testament, but you're not treating people right, and I hear that. That cry comes up to my ears, and I can't tolerate that kind of thing. And so you can see that time and again in Scripture. Isaiah and Micah, they're both contemporaries of one another, even though their books are separated by a little bit of other books, but they're speaking to the same condition at the same time. And it shows that people were not following the Lord in their relationships with other people, and it mattered. Okay? So you can see that. And then in 25 and 26, he says, settle matters quickly. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and the officer will throw you into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Until you've paid the last penny. And I think what he's doing, he's talking about the seriousness in the human court, but this is one of those things where the audience ought to get, if this could happen in the human court, how much more in the heavenly court? So this is really important to God. And I was thinking about how I used to envision Christian living as between me and God. It didn't really matter or involve anybody else other than I should just love people, which I thought, don't sin against them. That's it. But I've come to discover that the Bible is far more concerned with human relationships than I ever imagined. And so when you think about it, about 50% of the Old Testament instruction has to do with interpersonal ethics. 50%. That's a lot. And I think even more in the Ten Commandments, I think it's 6-4 ratio, has to do with interpersonal ethics. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Romans, which is the Magna Carta of Christian theology, right? It's the great one. It introduces its practical section with how to respond to God's grace in chapter 12. Do you want to know the outline of chapter 12? Yes, you do. I'm sure you do. Verses 3-8, we're to be a blessing. This is after the living sacrifice thing, and then he's going to tell us how. Be a blessing to the community with humility, verses 3-8. Verses 9-13, be devoted to one another in love with practical help. Verses 14-16, share in the lives of others with sympathy and humility. in verses 17 through 18. Do all you can to live at peace with others. Verse 19 through 21, don't retaliate, but bless others and overcome with good. And that's not it. If you follow the rest of the book out, it has to do with similar things. So this is, he said, essentially, here's the gospel. And then in chapter 12, here's how you live it out. And a lot of it has to do with interpersonal ethics. The summary of Christian virtue is active love toward God and man. We're out of time, but I just wanted to share that what Jesus is doing is showing the seriousness of interpersonal relationships and God's evaluation of our lives. We're not to let anger reside, and we're not to insult other people. And I think we kind of don't take this very seriously. Like, if you watch television, um, it's common for people to like insult people, and it's people get lots of laughs out of that, making fun of other people and tearing them down, and it can be really humorous, or at least people think so. And what we laugh at may also um, reflect what we think is really important or not important. And so I wonder if at times we're not taking this seriously enough. Like when we drive, do we do we call people names? I mean, you want to know your sanctification level, get in a car and drive down the road in frustrating traffic. You can find the truth, but we might feel really good when we're in church, but when we're on the road and people aren't cooperating, that's where our true humanity comes out. And so what Jesus is doing is showing the seriousness of all of this, and that could be a scary thought. And so tonight, I just wanted to make sure we got the right structural emphasis here, and I think what Jesus is emphasizing is, first of all, that murder and anger are really dealing with the same kind of sin. Okay, one is taking it to the far extreme, but the other is to show that both of these, the insults, lead to judgment, and not just in the human court, but in the heavenly court. So, hey, I appreciate the extra time you've allowed me. Um, so thank you for that. Let's stand and have a word of prayer. Sure. That's good, John. We not that we think you're crazy. We don't think you're crazy. Yeah, that's where it's at. I don't. We probably all think I could never do that. One, we don't know what we're capable of if the right circumstance were there, but that's not really the point. The point is that we need to honor Jesus with our lives, and He's not honored by anger and insults. He's honored when we live lives of love and forgiveness and kind words, and words that are seasoned with salt and they minister grace, right? So we don't want a rotten core that affects the whole watermelon. So let's let God change us. Hey, thanks for sharing, John. Let's have a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this word and the great application that John shared with us. Help us to be vulnerable with one another and to share our struggles and to be an encouragement. And we'll find out, Lord, that we're all facing this human condition that needs grace and help from you in every way. In Jesus'